So there is a lot going on in the news this week. So if it wasn't big enough news yesterday is that Lockheed has been identified as the gateway or the gatekeeper that has been blocking the information about these black projects, for lack of a better, of reverse engineering, which is the disinformation campaign. And I think that it's going to come out, and I think we all know it. I think the majority of people feel it, is that they know that, you know, this pantheon of gods linked in with the NASA missions that they use as their mantra to not only naming the missions, but the artwork and the depictions in sort of an ode to this particular zodiacal event named as a god, if you will. That the things that are happening that David Grush had to term, by the way, they're all just psyops, right? But David Grush had to term this non-human biologics. Wasn't calling them aliens. But what NASA likes to do along with the government is create this immediate assumption that it's from another planet. And this has been the psyop that has been proclaimed to have been in the works, cooking in the background, about to take place, where the big event is that they've been here all along, and that if you wanted to deem them gods, if you wanted to deem them angels, it depends on the parallax view of the perspective that you take. But what it undeniably leads to is what we really are. And that this would lead to an existential crisis and utter breakdown. And I think it's been done in a classification in a way to go through the batching out the human quality of this experiment. When I say experiment, I hate hearing that weird word because I connotate experiment with something that's done more ephemerally or finitely as an open and closed event, right? Double-blind study, if you will, infrared reliability studies. I'm not referring to experiment in that way. I'm saying experiment in the sense of it's going to derive certain informations filtered through it. How many billions of people does it take to refine and create this sort of almost like when you think of DNA, RNA scrambling, right? With the addition of uracil, you've got this observer effect of a spontaneous probability code in effect. So in other words, you've got something that where the ontology chooses, right? So all these programs are going and they're all adding to rigid structure, but the mathematics, as I've alluded to, is I would even say that it's there's exotic mathematics, and then there are mathematics that are outright erotic. In other words, number subsets and number systems like the number 5 and the number 9 that directly lead toward procreation, or the number 11 being one beyond perfection, let's say, right? Where you have the return to the monad. Anytime you see the 0 depicted, you're actually looking at the monad and the repeat of the monad. You really have to get into studying John Dee to begin to think in the way of these exotic mathematical formulations. The Gauss sequence is one, 101 on the way up, 101 on the way down. when you use that X as a binary, you'll see that it leads to diagonal mathematics. So if you have an event, say an event stream, you are able to hack into more event streams using the X, then cross-correlating and taking information. That's what memetics are. Memetic, the term memetic is used in more than one way. So on one hand, memetics is just the mimicking of, but then you get into the memetics of amino acids like the HPTA, where you have the first inferred 181 amino acids that cause your body, your hypothalamus to signal your pituitary to say, release more of that, thinking that there's already growth hormone in your system. Okay, this is what peptides are all based on. And this is like memetic sequencing. So what ends up happening is when you have this event stream and you have that diagonal mathematics going on, right? Which leads to the Star of David, Metatron's cube, the inference of this cross. All of this links back to the same mathematical junction point or sequence. Is that the diagonal version of this that's talked about in the Emerald Tablets, the Brothers Black, if you want to look it up, working at angles, right? Or angels. So you get into this and you go, wow, what is an angel? It's one who uses the angles, who can get the memetic code, and the entity already has hardwired into it, not just temporal, carnal, earthly information, right, as a pleroma or a bubble, to use more Gnostic terminology, but in a cosmic sense, through these layers of observance, or really quadrants and zones, you have even more expanding information occurring there, right? And this leads into a lot of the things. It's not trailing off of mounds, how families are used as signets in the coat of arms, the colors that they use, what the names mean. There's a lot more to name meaning than people feel comfortable with, right? And especially when we've been raised when we have a name like Smith, hearkening back to blacksmith, and we've never been shown or told anything about blacksmithing, right? Or my name, keeper of the stables, the horses, trainer of the stables, the noble stables, to never really have been exposed in a setting where it was not hostile, right? Because I have had exposure to horses. It was a very hostile situation. It wasn't one of mentoring and nurturing. It was a very bad experience, actually. And that time's over. And I told you yesterday, I knew some weird shit was going to happen. And then today, you got this shit with Charlie Kirk, and you have NASA admitting, right? Never a straight answer. You have NASA admitting, not entirely, right? They never do, but the existence of quite possibly microbial life. On Mars, they know way more than that and have, right? But this gets into areas that I've gotten into with very, very deeply in the past, where you sign off your rights. Somebody was telling me about somebody named Tammy Pepperman, and I think she's a little bit of a charlatan on that. But getting into Black's Law Dictionary, looking really deep into that. Look that up if you're looking for a rabbit hole to go down, but how all these legal terminologies were linked to witchcraft. It's almost boring, not almost, it's redundant and boring that all these roads do lead back to witchcraft. And I do not believe that females and witches and the ontology is the true aggressor here. I think that it's actually set up that way, right? That women became the fail-safe martyr to blame, but that they easily capitulated and supplicated to. Think about it. Think about what's going on today. You have these cucks and these insoles. And then you have going down the 4X line, which there are implications of a new man, right? So when we look at Nietzsche's work, and we look at the talk of the Overman or the Übermensch, right? And even Heidegger gets into this to some degree, right? He's talking about the effect on, rather than talking directly about the Übermensch, he's talking about the effect of the Dasein implementation of ontology. He's telling you right there, then and there, that the ontology is synthetic, right? He's displaying this. And Soren Kierkegaard thought this way, right? He thought this way. He knew it. It was Blaise Pascal. They understood this shit, and it was part of their genius that they saw the computational system. Instead of refuting it like most of us do, like, no, this couldn't be real. They went into the dark recesses of the anima and the animus, the Jungian, Bohm type computational system. And they went deep into it, where you see the manifestation with John Dee and what that type of thinking gets you, right? That he was looking for a release and he found none, because he forgot that he's a part of the fabrication. So what this gets into is morphic resonance and morphic field resonance of who we are. So if you can look down at the vibration of sand particles and see that frequency will affect the shape and the outcome in a symmetrical, uniform way, just with slight modifications, hertz, right? Like to use like 528, right? That Len Horowitz likes to talk about when he's talking about like solfeggio healing notes and so forth. Well, that's what we are. We are the morphic resonance of a particular set. So of course we're going to have this experience within our own time and our own solution. In other words, the frequency that's being emitted expresses not only us and the environment around us, right? And holds us at a certain reality, equidistant to the emanation center or the core. So what we're really looking for isn't the center of all things and the pure source, even though we think it is. What we are looking for is the fucking thing that's manifesting this resonant signal response, okay? Which is the sun, the moon, and whatever the hell's behind the sun that Crow 77 has been capturing in great detail with his high cost, high fidelity camera equipment that I urge you to check out if you haven't. Crow with 2 R's, CRROW. There was a time where Crow's work was debunked by someone who was using that P, whatever it is, camera. I talked about this another time. And supposedly that camera equipment other people had and got the same exact thing because there was a correction that was taking place with the zoomed in. It was something quirky with the camera itself that caused this wave pattern to go over the moon. And he hasn't really talked about it since then. He started focusing more on the sun because he really was, what he was doing when he was looking at the moon, he was going, the moon is not refracting sunlight. Even more so, it seems to be constant and consistent with manufacturing its own light, which to late other people have been looking at this as well, right? But more people are looking at the sun, right? So however you want to take that, I mean, you could go really deep with this. These are huge subjects that have a historicity that goes really, really deep, It goes into the moon, moon gods, moon goddesses, sin, right? And so forth. And obviously with solar deities, it's a massive compilation, but it leads into thelema, sex magic, Ouroboros, samsara, procreation, right? And it's a very complex subject that I tried to tackle with consciousness, because if we're all held in these morphologic field resonant combinants, which is our DNA, our telomeres expressly captivate us, isolate us into a certain form follows function, function into form morphology, right? But now with CRISPR and this sort of hacking, so the irony is, especially with Charlie Kirk and his killing, is that they're trying to use this special blend of magic where they're trying to play out the pathos, rhetoric, and sway, the play, that the aggressors, the far right aggressors, the ones who are total capitalists capitalizing off the grief of everyone else, are in fact the victims. That's what's happening here. They are the martyrs. They are playing the martyr card. Which, and I don't mean that, I mean that in both ways, right? But which leads to a universal justice breach. And believe it or not, there is justice. It's convoluted as fuck. Why all the trafficking? Why do kids go through what they go through? It's heinous, right? But if you were to look through the perspective of not even the perspective of like the devil's advocate, right? Not even going that far, but to look from a broader sense and go, if we back up when we think about this person going through this grief, who were they in their past life? And that's why they have us failing over and over again, failing ourselves, right? But even more so, to go through this terrible rape and sodomy and all the other terrible fucking things that are happening over and over again, it's to affect the morphic field frequency. So as long as we are keeping an active portion of that alive by just succumbing to our whims, wants, and desires to eat poison food, fast food, right? To search for porn, right? We're feeding into that, right? So many people are like, then what the fuck do I do? I mean, I'm living, and it's like, exactly, now you see the suffering that I would say higher tier complex thinkers, but I think most everybody is capable of this. In fact, it may even show a sign in a higher regard of being more evolved in a way as to hang on to the last moment until you absolutely have to, a sort of simplicity and purity, right? This is a world, this is a holiday, this is a turkey sandwich. I don't need to think about the sacrificing and the death that went behind this, or the plan, you know, which is the biggest part of this, the blueprint that made you implicit in the crime, right? That the harmony is okay as long as it's just you. It's ostracizing you. Do you see that? Do you see that it's a sin against yourself? That this is the complexity of it, is that you are an effulgent being. And that means that everything that you choose, every little movement and gesture you make, has to be done with meaning. And you know that, but you don't live your life that way because you don't live in a society like that. But imagine not even taking a breath or a movement without being able to weigh it out, right? And then you see the fixed rotation of the stars, right? So-called. I mean, I don't know what the fuck it is. I really almost think like something really is staring back at us, right? And we just can't see it because our eyes are not developed to that sense. You could say a Planck wall. You could use a lot of different terminologies, but that just maybe one molecule on a grander scale is something we couldn't even fathom, right? So all these probabilities are playing out, and they could be playing out in an alchemical petri dish or something even smaller, you know? It's a daunting idea, but the further you look at it, the more sense it would make, right? To localize a digloken, right? A cosmic event into one pinpoint cosmic phenomenon that links with other realities, but is separate based on a size model. I wrote about this a little bit in EPL, and I've revisited it a few times, but really you have these cosmic size models that don't fit in with one another, and they're made intentionally to not fit in, to not sync in with one another. In other words, one parallel reality is so immense or so minuscule, yet each one has its valuation, but they're taken out of congruence to where they create these firewalls that block out the signal transduction between field operations. I don't know if that makes sense. I think it does. So, realizing yourself and not realizing yourself as a self in the traditional sense of this is who I am in my family. You see, this leads back to the Master Key system written by Charles F. Haanel, a high-level Mason, that The Secret was based on. Okay, and it literally shows you from the beginning, it says you are a theoretical abstract ego if you don't take on the moniker of a father, a brother, a sister, a niece, a nephew, all these, a title, a manager at this particular fast food restaurant, whatever it is that you do, you take that duty on. So in other words, it's telling you to be stoic. And we see that stoicism then is a terrible thing to regard, and especially when you really look at Marcus Aurelius's the truth of why they call those his meditations, is that I believe, and I believe this since I started to look into them, in fact, the book is right there, I think, is that you have somebody who's writing an apologetic to themselves. In other words, they're keeping a diary that I believe at that time was a diary that says, this is the person I want to be. In other words, it was segmenting the individual and saying, but then when you look at young Faustina, his wife, who is a complete and total whore, like to the point where they couldn't conceal it through history. There's folklore surrounding Alexander, or I'm saying Marcus Aurelius. Did I say that? Yeah, because I like to do a comparative analysis of them. But young Faustina supposedly slept with this really high ranking general of Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius supposedly had him killed and then forced young Faustina to bathe in his blood, right? So whether or not you want to say that is a tyrannical ruler, he had to do these things because the world was evil, but this is who I really am, right? This is the virtue that I live by here, and I'm going to write it. So I believe that actually that was an aspect of Marcus Aurelius that was using this form of magic to solidify that this was the truth of who he was. And he was writing these lamentations to say, this is who I am. But I don't believe from a historical perspective that that's who he was. And I think that it can be found in Commodus, his son, as to him. So what does a good father do? A good father turns into a martyr for his sons, right? He's the dishwasher that works his entire life so that his offspring, whose sons can go and get educated, right? He's the guy who sacrifices his life, gives his fucking kidney for the son to go on and prosper, right? He's the one who carries on this generational perspective, but the Masons have a different idea or a different interpretation of generation, right? This is where the red rite ritual comes in. This is where Druidism comes in, is where they will actually evict somebody from a soul, from their actual body, in order to occupy that body and to take it on as their own. These are very explicitly laid out in Witcher literature and grimoire. So we have these parallel realities. The reality of who you are when you're thinking, who you are when you're sleeping, who you are when you're dreaming, who you are when you're relaxed, who you are when you're in a heightened state of alertness and awareness, who you are when you're combative and hormonal, who you are when you're just relaxed and happy. These transitional states don't cross-correlate with one another. They're entirely different identities. So how would you even fucking know it if another entity commandeered you from an early age and wasn't in fact there living and more present than you are all along? And when people begin to realize this and they're going on sort of a salvia trip or DMT, you name it, right? They get into this place where they feel a loss of identity, but even more so an identity that's based on a transitional cosmic unifying force. Let me put it like this, where why would it be that these Terence McKenna gnomes and the experiences would be so synonymous? Well, instead of looking at the gnomes, look back at yourself. Who's the experiencer? You follow? So we get back into the morphic resonance of who are you really? And then you get into this one singular soul or one singular identity that the Gnostics talked about, right? And you get into the aspect of the 12 disparate aspects of the zodiac, which are really 13. And then you also have in-between phases or stages, right? Like pink is a real color, but it's more of a hue. It's between, right, different phases when you have red, blue, purple, green, orange, yellow, what I say truth, and it starts out with purity, right? And these are expressed through emotional principles within the human psyche, if you will, but that's not really what's happening. Like, again, you'll get to a place where you want answers and then you turn to the existential and they give you psychology, but it leads you back just like any, so you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you look at Plutchik's wheel. Oh, you want an example? You want a socioeconomic example, right? You want a sociological example? In other words, we're going to filter it through that which provides for all people, right? So the end justifies the means, or the greater good is about keeping the masses enslaved and keeping the sheeple content with who they are. But none of us are content, are we? So this is what leads to the concepts of the ideation of liberty versus freedom. None of us have ever been free because we aren't freeing ourselves. And to free yourself is to actually free yourself from yourself. So this gets into very abstract themes because people are like, then what the fuck will I be? And it's like, you already know what you are, and you already know that when Jesus, so-called Jesus, right, talked about, or Isis, or King Isis, or however you want to term it, in the Gospel of Truth, talked about the jars, and these jars that were made to be aired, and that it was a very few, when he references 1 out of 1,000, 2 out of 10,000, right, you see how minute this number is, and how few are actually made as this proto, right? The progenitor. It gets a little bit into the Prometheus. And then why the fuck did James Cameron focus an ideation on Prometheus? Because then you can't help but look at Jason Reza Giorgiani, right? And you're going, holy fuck, what does any of this shit mean? And the thing that ties it together is the Jesus family tomb. James Cameron writes the entire foreword on that amazing book, the foreword. The other part of the book, the people, the scientists who are behind the finding and so forth, terrible writing, terrible book. So if you're going to read that, know that the foreword is the best part of the book. But yeah, it gets back into the Templars, the Masons, leads back into really what and then it infers, you're left with wanting to investigate more of the line of Cain and going back into the Ophites, back to Babylon, and then of course into Samaria and other, pieces of literature there that Michael Tessarian, Jason Reza Giorgiani, Neil from Gnostic Informant, right? You'd be able to, or break the rules, right? Live. Even to some extent, Uber Boyo surprises me a little bit. he can grapple with and play with some, but he's more ontological, right? It's not a bad thing. In other words, he's focused still on his development. He's trying to hang on to his development. You should be able to work out and train and still not give a fuck about whether or not you exist or not. I know that's a really tough concept because when you work out, you think you're actualizing, right? You think you're building yourself up. But the truth is that you need to represent a principle orientation, a soul force, and that becomes your whole reason and the resonance that you live by. So principles become everything. And I would just end there because it looped around in a perfect way, but not like in a Ouroboros, right? It's not Euroboric circular pi mathematics that just leads you in this. And so like from that perspective, you're listening to somebody who I could stand with the far right as much as I could stand with the far left woke. But let me clarify that at the end of the day, when you get into political agendas and the final, right, why control it, right? Why control it? So the far left actually has more validity in the fact that it doesn't feel in control at all. But it's using the science from the Gestapo to hack off its parts and say, I'm not a male or a female, right? And what I conjecture is that these people aren't bad. These people are bad. The far right is terrible, right? But in the discourse of Jason Reza Georgiani, what New Thinking Allowed, Jeffrey Mishlove really thought of, and why he wasn't further interviewing Jason Reza Georgiani, why those interviews just abruptly stopped. Jason spoke on this, and he said that Jeffrey thought he was one of these far right representatives, right? And so when you can't see that there's a fluidity there and that leads toward Hinduism and this third and even fourth sex, right? Because the thing is, it's not about male and female. It's about transposing beyond that and to realize that you all have always been that, right? And when a woman says, oh, I love feeling like a lady, right? Or a man likes to feel powerful and macho. That's not why you work out. That's why these days you can have a world-class female powerlifter training next to a world-class male powerlifter, right? And when you look at it, they're working with their own physiology. They're working with their limitations, but they're only working with the upper echelon, the upper, breaking beyond the barriers, right? And that development, that is principles. That's transcendence. And to break character and to try and live to characterize yourself and to try to then live for the world-class powerlifter to try to live as the mom, the sister, the wife, she is taking from a responsibility, right? And this is the same with men, right? So men really aren't on the right. And then you have this cross correlation where it goes, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to re-embody men into women's bodies and women into men's bodies and keep the Ouroboros going. People are starting to become privy to this and they're going, bullshit. I will be because we are developed beyond that. So this morphic resonance is keeping us trapped. So we're more complex than that. The ontology has become complex. We know that it's true, right? You can have a conversation with the biggest simpleton where you're like, I see this person taking the bus every day. And when you really begin to have dialogue and you're using a language where you can communicate, I've seen people and talked to people that had Down syndrome, worked at a grocery store for 40 years, and I'm listening to this person and they're fucking blowing me away because they have lived in this rigid structure, but they have defied all social norms and standards that they were supposed to live under, and it brought them into a different, higher area of ontology. They may not be using the terminology or the words that somebody who likes to use a lot of over-academic 50-cent words use, right? But to break beyond the ontology, that is our goal. And so you get into this idea of Prometheus. Well, isn't that your God, right? And that gets into tough territory, because then you have to define what your God is. And your God is what you show reverence to in everything that you do. So a God, in my estimation, is principle. It's the principle that you live by, the integer, where everything can be broken down into one specific principle, right? And to me, you're either dumbfounded by the fact that I've heard people, my own biological father identified himself as a person who is completely the most selfish person you'd ever meet in his life. I am paraphrasing what he said. That's how he regarded himself. He was never able to reach to the higher order and to understand what life's about and how expression ties into a deeper hidden truth that doesn't have to be hidden, right? Then you get into the fact that you really, when you quantize that, right, and you look at it in its essence, you're looking at a person who states, I believe in impurity. In other words, egalitarianism, democracy, liberty is all about this idea of self-expression, right? What about when you break beyond that? So to say that society should reach this point and then reach beyond this point, and then what do? You go toward selfhood? You go toward this Gestapo idea? No, that's just bouncing in this flux, in this paracosm of your own make. You have to be able to think beyond this. And that doesn't mean you thinking. It means being a part of the thought, letting go of yourself, not even embracing. You're not going through any action. You're just letting go, right? But you're focusing only on one thing alone. And to me, that's purity. That's the purification. That's the purity that you want to see your nephew, your niece, your environment, right? And then so you get back into this far right idea of what purity is. Like they took the 88 and they bastardized that and made it into something very unholy and, defiled it, right? Or was that the existential view of how it was seen? The swastika, you could say, did they do that with the swastika, right? So we don't know enough about what was really going on there, but what we do know is that there was an ideation with exactly what the CIA is covering up to this day. Also the MSS, Mossad, KGB, and organizations like Operation Gladio that link all this together. And we are choosing to live and to suffer under this governmental rule. We choose it every single day. We like the convenience of drinking the siren coffee, right? Because that's what that is. On the front of that Starbucks coffee, that mermaid represents the siren, right? When you flip it upside down, you're going to see the fish face. I've shown it on videos before. Nobody talks about this. Flip the cup upside down, you're gonna see these two big claws, and you're gonna see like this demonic face, and you'll be blown away when you first see it. Okay, so when you talk about the dogon and the fish people that are talked about throughout antiquity several different times, those who come from the sea, linking them to Sirius, and the Dogon tribe even gets into this, right? And I believe that this gets into the head binding rituals, the L.A. Marzulli, giant Nephilim type of things, and then just goes on even further from there, into very complex detail with these giants and what they were, what they represent, leading back to Tartaria, Shalaga, and this occulted networking where it's like, if we just don't obliterate every single trace of this culture, of this history, they're going to know that something's up. So another channel that I like to cite quite often is Stellium 7. Stellium 7. Stelium, I think it is. Where he started out as a hacker. There was a whole movie made about his character. He was like one of these, I think it was that one with Matthew Broderick. I can't remember the name of that, but I remember the movie. And he I think it was. I could be totally wrong on that. I'm just trying to remember something that's very vague, but he was one of the original hackers, teenage hackers, that hacked into this like government site, and it was like quite a fiasco that he went through. But he haphazardly sort of stumbled upon this idea where he was beginning to see these heart stones that he'd see these all over, and he's like, this looks just like a heart. It's the size of a heart. It seems petrified. It looks like a rock. And then all these people would start sending in and taking pictures of almost or near identical, till there was like hundreds and thousands of these things, right? And so he started to look at, like I was just talking to my son about this morning, which is Morro Bay. When you're going down to Pismo Beach, this weird little surfer town, nothing to see here. I think Jack LaLanne lived there in his later years. But you drive down into this town and there's this big fucking rock that looks like some dead turtle in the middle of the fucking harbor bay. Well, Stellium-7 looks at areas like this, some known, some not that well known, but it does lead into a lot of the things that Operation GCD looks at. J.J. Vance, when he's looking at his latest fixation on mounds, right? And how all these giants are buried in these mounds, right? That really hints to a torsion field energy. That is a shared morphic resonance at a certain elevation that will channel throughout the world and connect these specific burial sites so that it will keep their codified energy or their information intact. Okay? And the pyramids could be based on this as well, where they all channel back to the same frequency. So it seems like I'm going off on a tangent here, and I am a little bit, but you've got Sadi, the Zoroaster, depicted and written about. He comes from this single father who is a horse. He basically breeds and breaks horses for nobility, right? Young Sadi, this woman comes, and when he's just hitting his tween years, and says, I want to take over the rearing of this child, right? I want to raise him the rest of the way. He needs a mother. And I think his mother either left or passed away. I think she may have passed away or something. I don't even know if it really gets into detail about that. I did read the book. I had the book. I gave it to my son, and then it was lost. But it's an amazing book about the Persian forerunner to, some say, Jesus Christ, right? Or a figure like this. Because that's what he was doing, is he proclaiming the coming of either an energy. So you could look at this as the age of Aquarius or the Piscean, like this transitional stage, right? And so Jason Rizzo-Giorgiani focuses on this much more so, and says that the depictions of the Zoroaster wasn't 35 to 3,700 years ago, as people like to allude to. It was probably more in the neighborhood of 2,500 years ago. And he goes into really a lot of detail with this, in his writings and his research. So 500 BC, somewhere thereabouts. But the cross-correlation with the Zoroaster, I forgot where I was going with that. But obviously my throat's kind of breaking up. I need to chill and focus on breathing, because it's getting hotter, it's getting warmer, it's getting really stale in here. And when I have the window open, it sounds like I'm yelling out the window. So I like to be able to just kind of like finish up my posts first and then go on to being able to breathe. So that's where we're going to end it today. We'll see you during the workout in a little while.